To A Blossoming Saguaro. You have kin in Mexico. Shooting you is called cactus plugging. Humidity and wind speed shape the path of a bullet. Your shadow will outlive my father. That's kind of comforting. Ghost-faced bats pollinate your dog-eared flowers, which smell like wet rope, melon. The sky is a century with no windows. Sorry, I say things like that. You have more rights than the undocumented. I need a permit to uproot you. Ophelia believes only rain can touch all of you. My mother is my favorite immigrant. After her, the sonnet. So, ever since returning to the US post-Fulbright, I've been finding myself in the middle of this really arduous job search, which has me craving a lot of distraction from the search itself, if I'm being honest. As a result, I tend to get on my phone a lot and scroll because it provides that quick hit of pleasurable distraction if I let it. But I've been finding increasingly that there is another way of getting that same feeling that I think in the long term is probably healthier, and so I wanted to share it with you. In case you don't know who I am, my name is Jay. I hold an MFA in creative writing from North Carolina State University. I'm one half of the St. Balthasar University English Club podcast, where we critique the internet's worst books as though they had been submitted to us for a workshop. And today I want to share 3 beginner-friendly poetry books to show you that poems are not obscure or elitist or hostile as you might have previously felt, and that I think they can probably help you kick that scrolling habit if that's something that you're interested in doing. As much as it hurts me, physically, to say these words, poetry is, in a way, short-form content. Or, at the very least, it is content, it contains things, and it's a shorter form than other writing. It's also fundamentally an attempt to communicate via a system of patterned language. And once you've learned how to recognize those patterns, you'll be able to access a new kind of reading that, for me, satisfies the same urge as scrolling, but on a deeper level. In the ideal poetry reading scenario, you're met with something that surprises you in a good way at semi-regular intervals, but instead of leaving you feeling muddled and kind of bleak, reading poems for a bit always makes me feel as though I'm breathing again for the first time in way too long. Today I've got 3 books for us, and we're going to go through them in order of complexity, from least complex to most complex. Simultaneously, the first and last book will be general, so they'll both cover a wide variety of poetry crafts, and the one in the middle will be very specific and focus on exactly one poetic device. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, the first book that I'm excited to recommend to you today is Mary Oliver's A Poetry Handbook, which I have right here. It's a really great place to start if you don't remember much of what you might have learned about poetry in, say, high school or college, or if your teachers even skipped over the poetry units entirely, as a couple of my teachers did from elementary on through high school. On the other hand, if you studied creative writing, or if you have a better memory, you might find that some of the stuff in this book is a little bit familiar. Even so, though, I think that this book absolutely warrants picking up because it functions as a handy little compendium of the fundamentals that you can turn to if you ever need to take a look. Even after earning my MFA, I sometimes return to this book when I'm feeling sort of unmoored, when it feels like poetry can be too many things and everything is too subjective and too unknowable. This book basically helps me recenter myself with its kind of simple, essential definitions of words like stanza, which it describes as the term by which we designate a group of lines in a poem that is separated from other groups of lines. When I'm feeling totally lost, I can read that and be like, okay, Jay, you can write a stanza, you can write some lines, you can group them together, you can do this. That's how poems get made. Here's some gems from this book that I really enjoy. The first one is, every poem contains within itself an essential difference from ordinary language. No matter how similar to conversational language it may seem at first, the space between daily language and literature is neither terribly deep nor wide, but it does contain a vital difference of intent and intensity. So, in this section, Oliver is asking us basically to keep 2 things in mind. Art doesn't happen by accident is the first one. It takes intentional use of the application of various rhetorical devices to make good poems, and an understanding of how those devices work to interpret those same poems. Second, readers will want a sense that there is some justification for the art's existence. Basically, just a sense of emotional urgency on the part of the creator, that there are stakes to the thing being created. Very often in poetry, those stakes can be like mega low. Just the speaker giving this sense that it's urgent, that they express the thing that's in the poem, can be enough. But those stakes have to be there, or a poem is probably going to end up feeling a little bit lethargic or smug. If you go to enough workshops or you read enough poems in magazines or in collections, you will inevitably come across a poem that feels like it was written because the writer wanted to flex the fact that they can craft a really tight poem, and not because they actually had any emotion or thought to share with you. And those poems are always super off-putting. So again, Oliver is basically just reminding us that poems need a sense of emotional stakes to them. There is something to be gained, and that is a deeper understanding between reader and poet. Here's another gem from this book that I really like. Poetry is a river. Many voices travel in it. Poem after poem moves along in the exciting crests and falls of the river waves. None is timeless. Each arrives in a historical context. Almost everything in the end passes. But the desire to make a poem, and the world's need of it, these never pass. I love that she says that nothing is truly timeless here. It always really bothered me in high school and even all the way up through grad school when a professor would say that a poem was timeless, because no, it isn't. Everything is more and less relevant depending on who is reading it and when. There is no poem, there's no piece of art, there's no novel that is universally applicable or relatable or useful to every single human being that ever has and ever will lived. It's a completely ridiculous idea. But what I like even more about this is that as a writer and as a reader, I think it takes the pressure off of understanding and creating poetry. Nothing that you read or write is eternal. None of it is going to be the most important poem ever. All of it is just stuff that you or other human beings are making. It's really that simple. But as I said at the outset, I think the book's greatest value is probably in its really concise, accessible breakdowns of the fundamentals. It has chapters on sound, on rhythm, on tone, on lines, all that stuff. And at just 120 pages, you can read it in an afternoon. I want to close out on a piece of advice that I think would vastly improve like probably 90% of beginner poems that I've ever workshopped. And here it is. When you use the words the apple or the peach, you are representing a thing. If you drop the article and use the word alone, apple or peach, you are moving away from the direction of the particular and towards the abstract. Apple is only a word meaning any or all apples. It is not a thing. Thus it is unseeable and it vanishes from the realm of the imagined real. The world is full of sensory detail. The poem needs this sensory detail also. The second book on our list today will not surprise any channel regulars. It is James Longenbach's The Art of the Poetic Line, an absolutely essential book for readers and writers of poetry. It is, I have to be honest, a mite more difficult to read and a lot more specific. So, as you might guess from the title, it is all about lines. Specifically, three things. How sound moves through them, even in modern, unrhymed poems. Yes, you might be surprised to hear that meter and sonic devices like rhyme, like consonants, like assonance, are all still very significant, just more subtle. It also talks about how association guides readers from one line to the next. We'll be going in a bit more on that in just a moment. And most importantly, how poets can use line endings to make and subvert meaning. We're not going to talk much about sound because I find that tends to get really technical and bore people, so we'll stick with the latter two, which I think are probably the most important anyway. Again, I have talked a lot about this book on the channel, and I really cannot overstate how important those last two concepts are for the development of poetry today. So let's start with that association bit. If you don't understand associative logic, which is what we call the process of getting a reader to understand ideas in a poem through a string of associations, you won't be able to understand poems as a reader. And if you can't create these associations as a poet yourself, you won't be able to keep readers interested. Likewise, if you cannot break your lines in associating ways, readers are going to zone out. And if you don't understand why poets are breaking lines where they are, you will quickly become very, very lost reading today's poems. So it's really a failure to understand these two principles that lead to like 99% of problems in poems by people like, for example, Rupi Kaur. When she breaks anecdotes into arbitrary lines, she creates these quote-unquote poems that are not associative and they're not interesting on the level of the line. So you have to kind of wonder why they even exist. And if you want to know why I think they exist, you can check out my longer video on Rupi Kaur. But briefly, what even is this associative logic thing? Well, basically, associative logic is the principle that a chain of associations, rather than a sequence of chronological events, are the thing that lends poems their momentum. So in fiction, events will typically follow a chronological order, barring obvious exceptions like flashbacks or dreams or maybe weird experimental stuff. Poems also tend to have this narrative logic too, but poems as a medium do association better than other types of writing. So in this book, Langenbach is basically arguing that poets should be aware of that fact and make the most of associative power. And he is right to say that. I think he's just objectively correct. Let's take the poem To A Blossoming Saguaro by my mentor from undergrad and grad school, Eduardo Carrel. This poem is made up of a collection of pretty concise sentences, all of them linked by the speakers associating them with a particular saguaro cactus that he is implied to be looking at. The observations are not really given in an order that we could call chronological, nor are they made up of a thesis followed by supporting arguments, as you might expect from, say, argumentative nonfiction. We know from the title that most of the poem's contents are going to be describing the speaker's relationship to the cactus, a relationship that's defined by the speakers associating the cactus with the undocumented immigrant experience. If we look at just the first two lines, both of which could operate completely independently of each other, it's awareness of the cactus that helps us understand what's being described. And the introduction of kin in Mexico in the first line that makes the second line read as a little bit more sinister and gets us thinking about what the speaker and his relatives, who will continue to appear throughout the poem, have maybe endured. It's the introduction of this sinister element early in the poem that prepares us for the pair of lines that come later. You have more rights than the undocumented. I need a permit to uproot you, which might otherwise feel sort of inexplicable and out of the blue. Basically, if you've ever been reading a poem and felt like the speaker switched topics really suddenly in a way that was difficult to follow, it was probably because they were implying there was some kind of association between those two ideas. That, or it was just a bad poem, which can also happen. I've gone over the taxonomy of line types that Langenbach outlines in this book like probably a golly gee drillion times on the channel already, but in case this is your first time here, I will walk us back through the basics. So in Langenbach's theory, there are three basic types of lines. The easiest to understand is simply the end-stopped line. These are lines that end in some kind of punctuation. They tend to feel the most final, especially when the line ends in a period. One of the main things that these end-stopped lines can do is provide real relief for the reader after like a long string of associations. But used too frequently, they carry the risk of making a poem feel sort of lumbering. Notice I say risk, though, because there are very few absolute certainties in poetry. I would be incorrect to say that, like, too many end-stopped lines will make a poem feel lumbering, because, for example, the poem we just looked at is almost completely made up of end-stopped lines, and to me, it doesn't read as lumbering at all. So the second type of line, then, is the parsing line. Parsing lines basically end alongside normal pauses of syntax, places that if you were speaking out loud, you would be likely to pause even if there isn't any punctuation, not even a comma. As I mentioned in my video on Rupi Kaur, one of her work's major weaknesses, at least in her first book, is an overuse of these parsing lines. Used carelessly, similarly to end-stopped lines, these can just totally annihilate a poem's pacing because they become very predictable very quickly. They're absolutely necessary for aiding comprehension in situations where you want to give readers a break without fully end-stopping a line, but again, use them too much and the poem will really slow down. Finally, there are annotating lines. These line endings cut against normal syntax, so they end in places that are surprising or unusual. They really often get used to create double meanings or to emphasize words that normally would get buried in a sentence. They can also create slant rhymes or other more subtle sonic devices, but the main thing that they do is suspend closure for the reader. These are lines that poets use to build up tension and do a lot of work to keep poems feeling sort of dynamic. I really like this pair of annotating lines from Henri Cole's poem Casablanca Lily. It is the smell of not saying what I feel, of irrationality intruding upon the orderly, of experience, seeking me out, though I do not want it to. As a little side note, you will often see poets break lines, whether they're parsing, annotated, or completely end-stopped, on words like intruding, because what could be more intrusive than breaking a line off, suspending comprehension in the mind of a reader on a line like intruding? As a poet myself, the temptation to break lines on words like stop, or look, or cut, or break, or hear can be absolutely irresistible at times. So if you ever see that in a poem, know that it was probably the poet having a little bit of fun. Last but definitely not least, we have, again, James Longenbach, this time How Poems Get Made. This book completely changed my approach to reading and writing poetry, so if you're able to stomach it, I highly, highly recommend you pick up a copy. I'm not gonna lie though, this is definitely the most ambitious of the three, and it kind of expects that the reader will already have a base level familiarity with the essentials of poetry. So if you read the Oliver and you like it, maybe get this one next. On the other hand, if you already studied creative writing in undergrad or in a workshop outside of school altogether, you might be ready for this one already. If this is the first book on poetry that you ever read, though, I wouldn't blame you for feeling that it's a little bit pretentious or like it's intentionally throwing up walls to keep you out, because his language can be a little bit dense. Here's an example of what I mean. In the preface, Longenbach basically argues that it's really important for artists to understand the strengths and limitations of their chosen medium. So there are things portraiture can do better than photography and vice versa, ditto for fiction and poetry. Poets need to understand this, he's saying, because if they don't, they won't be able to write good poems. They'll spend their time trying to write poems that poetry just can't really do. But here is how he expresses the idea that I just tried to express in more simple terms. Neither the analysand nor the artist may indulge in any infantile wish of dominating the medium completely. For if the artist loves the medium enough to submit himself to its actual qualities, resisting exaggerated notions of what the medium can do at his beck and call, then the result will likely be something recognizable as a work of art, a transaction between the mind and the world that is played out in the material reality of the medium. Now, if you're really bought into poetry already, as I am, this is very exciting stuff conceptually, but if you're still getting your sea legs, I can totally see why this might feel almost repulsive. If you were interested initially in picking up Longenbach's Art of the Poetic Line, but then me reading this section of How Poems Get made you nervous, I want to reassure you that he writes in a little bit more accessible language in this one because it's part of a craft series for a more general readership. So if you want to check this one out, but you're too nervous to check out the other Longenbach, I think you should be okay. Anyway, there are a few gems that I want to pick out from How Poems Get Made, which I share both to whet your appetite and to make sure that anybody who doesn't feel like picking up this book can still get the most important bits out of it. So gem number 1. We should always know who is speaking in a poem and why. This really ties back into Mary Oliver's idea that poetry needs this intensity. We need to understand the stakes of the poem again. Why is it important to the speaker to express this idea right now? And for that to work, we need to know, who is speaking in the first place. We don't need a complete resume, just enough details to give us a sense of what is essentially the protagonist of our poem. Are they a young lover? Are they a middle-aged gardener? Are they an avid thrift shopper? In contemporary poems, subject position can answer this question as well. So does the speaker belong to some marginalized group, for instance? And if so, how does that subject position shape their relationship to the poem's themes? Gem number 2 from How Poems Get Made is a little bit of a mindfuck. Repetition isn't real. I think I've said this on the podcast before, but this is where this idea comes from. Longenbach writes that each successive instance of an event is infused with a recollection of the initial instance, which inherently alters our relationship to it. So in other words, nothing ever truly happens twice, because your ability to recognize that something has happened before means that the second time it happens, it's different, because you remember the first time. This is actually why patterns like rhyme in poems work at all. You need to remember having heard a sound before for the second time the sound appears to recall the first time. Longenbach also writes that variation is just an inevitable component of pattern, which is why it's really important that poems are constantly establishing and then breaking patterns at the moments where doing so is most impactful. The chorale poem that we looked at earlier does this really well. The first half of the poem introduces us to the cactus, the speaker, and his relationship to the undocumented experience. Then, right in the middle, we have this inexplicable line, for which the speaker then apologizes, introducing some humor previously absent from the piece. Longenbach writes, "Especially when we're in love, repetition may threaten to degenerate from rapture to routine. The feelings we point to with a word like rapture wouldn't feel authentic if they weren't so poignantly contingent, and, as Freud suggests repeatedly, the adult psyche may fall too easily into an unproductive repetition of what matters to it most. This is why poets, like lovers, must continually reanimate ways of doing the same thing over again, no matter how enduring the achievement of the previous poems." So, not only is Longenbach advocating for variation within pattern within individual poems, he's arguing that over the course of their lifetime, a poet or reader needs to continually seek out variation within the practice of reading and writing, or else the spark will fade. I think that scrolling also sort of reinvents itself, but in a more insidious way. The pace at which, for instance, memes these days appear, go viral, become irrelevant, and then have this ironic resurgence has accelerated unbelievably during my lifetime. When I was in middle school, a particular popular meme might have had like a full school year's worth of staying power. By the time I reached high school, it was like maybe a couple months or less. Now, in my mid-20s, I swear that I see memes experience their entire life cycle sometimes in the span of like a week. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I can't definitively say that immersing yourself in that culture is like unhealthy, but I do know for a fact that it feels bad to me. So if you're in a similar spot where you really desire this like short form content, where you want a repeated refresh of new and exciting material, I would encourage you to pick up one of these books, then use what you've learned and read a couple of poems. I mean, try it, and then if you hate it, your phone will still be there. So really, what is there to lose?